The title of this panel is Double Degrees in Graduate, Postgraduate degrees, Master's degrees, or PhD diplomas. We have been working all year doing monthly meetings. We also held one in-person meeting in Boca Raton. And today we will be presenting our findings and conclusions. Let me introduce the team. We have Claudia Inés Ayala Rueda. I can read her bio. He is a civil engineer. He has a master's degree in project management, dean of the School of Engineering of Simón Bolívar University. We also have Jaime Uribe joining us on Zoom. I don't know whether we can see him, but he is an industrial engineer specialized in production management and operational management. Of course, I'm not going to read the entire bios, but we also have Sonia Elena Contradas Ortiz, also an electronic engineer and a master's degree from the Industrial University of Santander. We had Fabián Benicio Hernandez, who is not here just yet. He comes from Chihuahua. We also have Edgar Alexander Lopez Gomez here, National Dean of Engineering of the University of Colombia. We also have Aldo Pardo Garcia, who is joining us after his recovery. He is an electrical engineer. From the University of Russia, and we have Marlo Ariz from the UPL. He is president of IFESA. We also have Remy Eten Luna, dean of the Technological University of Santiago. Libis Valdez Cervantes, who just left or is sitting at the back. She is the president of LACCEI, and me, Martín Fernández Alconada, from the School of Engineers of Tardes. And I'm responsible for this idea of trying to understand the issues around double degrees. So we will go ahead and give the floor first to Luis Manuel, who can tell us why a double degree. Luis Manuel, go ahead. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Luis Fernando. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. And as for the question about why choose a double degree, well, I think that there are multiple answers to this question. There are many different reasons to pursue a double degree. In Europe, under the Bologna process, well, that was created to compare the different universities and degrees so that degrees could be easier to understand, as well as to create a sense of unity in Europe. In Europe, we've been through a lot of wars, a lot of centuries fighting each other. So the best way to ensure peace is by being friendly with your neighbors and with the rest of the world. That is why we thought it was important that our future leaders had that feeling of identity and unity. And the best way is doing that from education, from the training of future professionals and future leaders of each country. This seems like a great idea at the beginning, but it very quickly fell short because the European idea of being able to move goods from one places to another, but not being able to transfer degrees, well, that was a problem. I'm from Spain and I can move and work in Italy or France, but I can't transfer my degree. So how am I going to do it, right? That is a challenge, right? We need to find equivalences, and it's a slow process. Sometimes different countries have different regulations. So naturally, we came up with the need to create joint degrees or double degrees so that professionals could work in different countries without seeking standardization of degrees. So, we slowly started working on bilateral collaborations and collaborations to develop programs that are easily understood so that future professionals could work in more than one country. So why pursue a double degree? Well, I think this is something that should be interesting to everyone, to students who are going to be our future professionals, but also to companies and to the society as a whole, and to the governments, of course. Nowadays, we see a lot of products coming from abroad or products from our countries being sold abroad, and the standards applied are different in each country. The most palpable example of this in Europe is the steering wheel. Some countries have the steering wheel on the right side, some have it on the left side, right? And some countries are more strict with their standards. Some allow for greater pollution or emissions, some for lower emissions. That is something that you need to consider when producing vehicles. Consumption measures also vary from country to country. So this means that companies need to be familiar with legislations of other countries, and they need their professionals to be in contact with professionals from other countries as well. We need to work across the board. If you are a company and you hire a professional who is able to work in a different country, well, that professional will likely be familiar with foreign legislation, and that is, of course, very useful. So this is a reason why double degrees can be attractive for students, because they open up the doors for new possible jobs in other countries. So a university offering double degrees makes it more attractive to a greater number of students. The society as a whole will benefit from this exchange of people, from this mobility of professionals from one country to another. Back in the 1980s, we started talking about globalization, thinking globally and acting locally. That was born out of the need of companies that were selling products in other countries. So they were starting to think with a global mindset, but having to act locally. And in order to act locally, you need to have double degrees. From the point of view of us here, and from the point of view of the academic sector, this means some hard work. It's easy to stick to our own standards and have our professionals work only in our countries, but it is necessary to obtain double degrees. And I don't think that universities should look at double degrees as a goal in and of itself, right? Having double degrees in order to attract more students. Of course, that is true, but universities have to think about the process. And the process means hard work. And hard work means comparing institutions, working with other institutions. So we need to be able to look at the challenge of double degrees as an opportunity for improving our own curriculums. Double degrees require an effort, but we have to look at that as an opportunity for improvement, creating curriculums that can be standardized in other countries, and so on. a lot of universities offer possibilities for double degrees, and each is different depending again on the standards in each country. So I'm sure this will mean a lot of work, but it's something that we need to do. In order to fulfill this goal, we need to have a commitment and willingness and a team in each institution, who are committed and convinced that double degrees are worth working for. And how do we do this? Well, that's a whole different challenge, right? We need executive teams and executive boards to be committed with the benefits of double degrees. They need to understand that double degrees are going to be useful for their students, for their professionals, and for themselves. And that depends on each university, of course. In my case, I am from Valencia, and in my university, we measure everything. We measure all of the activity carried out by the faculty, meaning management, teaching activities, everything is quantified and measured. And this makes it so at the end of the year, we can receive a productivity incentive based on what we produced in excess of our goals. That's, of course, translated into a bonus, a productivity bonus that we receive. In Spain, that bonus can be up to 20% of our yearly salary. So you can receive a bonus pay at the end of the year in December based on whether you have fulfilled different criteria and different objectives. Of course, we can't all be the best in the fields of teaching, research, and development, right? Each needs to work on their own fields. And each university can decide how to provide incentives to their staff. We need executive boards who believe in the benefits of double degrees, like I mentioned, and we also need faculties to get involved as well. If the staff is receiving an incentive to do their job, of course, they'll do it better. And I'm sorry to tell you, I have to leave now. I can't stay for the rest of the session, but I have to run to do something for my university, so I have to be somewhere else. So I'm sorry. If you record this session, I will be glad to watch it later. Of course. Thank you, Luis Manuel. If you know somebody who would like to follow this panel, we are live streaming on our official YouTube channel, and we will also record it so we can upload it later. Thank you, Luis Manuel. And I want to add something. As one of the people who participated in the Bologna process for the standardization of double degrees in graduate and PhD diplomas, I wanted to add that there's a huge interest at the professional level, meaning if you have a degree from Colombia, Brazil, or Argentina, these professionals don't have to submit a foreign degree to work in other countries. This is an advantage because that would take years. I even know couples who met each other during standardization degrees, and they have to choose where to go to work because they can't standardize their degrees in the other country. When you're an engineer and you arrive at a country, it's very hard to start working. I had a colleague in Brazil who wanted to create a civil construction company. He called me up and asked me, how can I certify my degree? And I was like, don't worry. Go ahead and hire a Brazilian engineer because it'll take like 10 years for you to standardize your degree. So if you participate in these programs, you can have international degrees, and that opens up the door for new jobs all across Europe. And also there is the language aspect of it. Double degrees take around 1 year, 1.5 years, and cultural and linguistic immersion across that period is rich. It's richer than what you can do in 6 months, of course. Okay, we will go ahead and continue with our session. Thank you, Luis Manuel. And we have other experts here who have worked on looking at the challenges of putting together these double degree programs. We're going to have a few questions here addressed to all of you. The first one is, how important is it to sign a framework convention for creating double degrees? Can you just create a double degree program, or do you have to have a framework convention that the country needs to sign? Please go ahead. You now have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon already. Before signing the agreement, there's something very important. That is the desire of the institution to do it. Once the desire is there, the documents have to be reviewed, because I cannot enter into an agreement with a certain university until I don't know what programs they have, what processes they have, because that will tell me whether I will continue with the process or not. Once the agreement is executed, a framework agreement is executed for a first approach. It doesn't mean that I'm going to do a dual degree. I can stay with the framework agreement. And there I start doing joint researches, mirror lessons, and I can stay with that. That feeling or that approach I have, all those good practices, will show me whether it's worth approaching a dual degree, because there I will start knowing the university. My students will give me some feedback about how they are doing at the university, and that will ensure that the framework agreement will take me to the specific agreement. The framework agreement will be a good beginning, but it will ensure the good basis for a future. The future would be the dual degree. That's very important, but they are not dependent on one another. One gives me the foundation to reach the other. An example of that framework agreement and the specific agreement, well, is our University of Pamplona. A framework agreement was signed with the University of Rovira i Virgili in Tarragona, and it included a special agreement. There are several students now at the PhD in automation that will also receive the degree of the PhD in electronics from the Rodrigo Virgili University through co-tutorships. And that was done thanks to the education of several PhDs of ours at the Rodrigo Virgili University, and several PhDs that we have. We have projects with the European Commission, and that has strengthened the relationship. Another Rodrigo Virgili University also approved the dual degree with us, with these co-tutorships. And there are 3 students now doing the co-tutorship. So in any of the universities, you receive the degree from both universities. So, I mean, the questions are not addressing any specific speaker. Anybody can take the floor. I see that Jaime is with us remotely. If you want to say something, you just raise your hand. You can have the floor whenever you want. Well, obviously, the importance of signing a framework agreement is very important to achieve the dual degree, because that includes the purposes of the agreement, what are going to be the basis to create the dual degree among the 2 or 3 institutions. Gustavo was speaking of dual and triple degree. So we consider that's the most important thing, the framework agreement, so as to carry out these activities among institutions. So let's move on to the next question. What resources and additional infrastructures, apart from the papers that have to be signed, would be necessary to support the dual degree program? I can take that. Well, first, thank you for allowing me to be part of this commission. It's very important. Through LACCEI, we have participated with many colleagues from so many countries. And it has been very interesting. About these additional resources that are necessary for the sustainability of these dual degree programs, I think there are 3 important factors. That is the academic part, the administrative part, and resources. About the academic part, everything starts with the framework agreement that we mentioned, because that dual degree cannot just appear suddenly in the institution. There has to be a gradual insertion in the community so that teachers also can get to know the other university and learn about the education that students are receiving there, so they can have a level of knowledge and a curriculum that is very similar. So the experience of the students is rich when they visit that other university. As to the administrative aspects, there are many resources that should be made available, because it's not just that the student gets to the university. He should have boarding, support. We cannot leave them on their own when they get to another country, another institution they are not familiar with. And there should be a person responsible for welcoming them and offering the induction and all the support throughout their stay at the university, or at least at the beginning. And the person that is responsible for all the administrative aspects of those dual degree students, probably a new department should be created, because this process deserves a different treatment. And if it's the same as the treatment used for local students, it's not the same. This calls for personnel that is specially trained for these kind of relationships. As to resources, well, we are developing countries. Our students and their families are not in the best economic situation. So having funds available for mobility, for the students to have a place to stay, food, etc. That's very important as well. So perhaps it's possible to obtain some income, not from the universities, but perhaps from other institutions as incentives. That would be very beneficial to make this more feasible. In the academic aspect, the labs, it's very important to be in accordance with the dual degree program, just like technologies and the resources available for the teachers that will be involved in the dual degree, so that remotely they can interact with the students when necessary, and they can have the resources that they need to educate those students. Good morning. Thank you for this opportunity of participating in this committee. About resources, it's important to see that the student that dares obtain a dual degree, as institutions, we should offer them all the support, as he said, and also the language aspect. Very often, the opportunities are limited because the students are not proficient in the language of the institution, so they cannot obtain the dual degree as a result. So it's very important to closely support the students to make sure they meet those requirements and that they can obtain their dual degree. And something that sometimes we forget is the issue of university well-being for the students of the PhD, psychological support, financial support, everything that has to do with the well-being of the student throughout their PhD studies. Very often, our institutions in Latin America are focused on the undergraduate and graduate courses, and they are not so focused on well-being. I would like to add that the quality of this educational program is very important. It should be permanently evaluated. So maintaining a system that makes it possible to measure the feedback of the students, to ensure the continuous improvement of the program, to make sure it gives the results that the institutions and the students are expecting. I see that this dual degree process is a win-win process, a mutual benefit. A student that will have the privilege of participating, because my student goes to your university, I will support them in this process, and you as well, because the burden is distributed. So I see this as something very positive, and the resources can be shared. We support different parts of the process, but the student will belong to both of us. So I see this as a win-win. Anybody else? Jaime, would you like to add anything? Yes, can you hear? Thank you. There's an important aspect to consider here. And it's very important to have access to this dual degree. I'm having some issues with the sound. I will try. I'm hearing myself. Now it's better. So it would be important to have virtual platforms. They can be very useful because they would allow us to save a lot of money in mobility. So we could analyze other options in order to have these processes. It's very important to have virtual platforms, Moodles, Blackboard, any of those platforms that are available. And we should consider within these resources and infrastructure, these platforms that are very useful for the dual degree processes. Thank you, Jaime. I can add to that there are several aspects about resources and infrastructures that are necessary. On the one hand, we have the person, the student, that needs some moral support, the students that are traveling 4,000 kilometers from their homes. They don't have their parents to have a shoulder to cry on, and that's very important. Sometimes say, well, this is just another student, and we don't pay attention to the stress they may be under. I have spent hours with students explaining, don't worry, you are away from home, and then that support is very interesting. And then the resources, we have to be creative about it. With universities that require payment at their university, for instance, students that want to have a dual degree in the States, and they are willing to pay $20,000, okay, but we can do it in pairs. You send me a student that pays for your university, and I send you a student that pays for my university. And so we are 50-50. That's one of the reasons why in the UK they did not accept foreign students, because they said if everybody comes to learn English, we will have to pay a lot of money to our professors. And that led to the requirements. Before going to a country to learn their language, you should show us that you already speak the language. Well, if I already speak the language, why would I go to the country to learn it? I say that one of the values was the linguistic value, but we can have dual degrees between universities even in the same city, that is, two institutions recognizing the degree. And sometimes we think, well, it's a dual degree, that means going abroad. No, there are sister universities that can say, okay, let's collaborate and show the ministry that we are not enemies and that we can create diplomas together. And when I say being creative, for instance, with Argentina, they didn't have a lot of money, but they had two students that wanted to have the dual degree. They were rugby players. My city is an area where rugby is quite significant. So we got two clubs that paid for their food, a car, the apartment, etc. So they stayed for 3 years under this scholarship of studies and sports. So they had to play on Sundays. And in the meantime, the clubs funded the course. And the university, it didn't cost them anything. So everybody was happy. So we have to find a way to collaborate and satisfy these need of the student to have an international experience. Let's move on to the next question. What are the dual degree formats used among your universities? There's a model that you have to fill out to pay our taxes. We each have our own method. Let's see, let's hear from you. Based on what we discussed before, of course, well, first let me thank you for inviting me to participate on behalf of my university in Colombia. It has been very important for us. We have dual degree processes and some things, but in isolation. So with this process through LACCEI, we have something more structured now that will allow for members of LACCEI to and execute these dual degree agreements. Each university has their own administrative issues that are different. So in those common aspects, like language or the results of the learning here and there, and how through credits or through the standardization process, it can be done. In the case of a review, of course, I took the case of Colombia, the rules we have in Colombia. And based on that, what most universities in Colombia do in terms of dual degree processes is, well, there are some external instances like the WIP that issues some calls for dual degree processes, establishing some parameters that have to be met, as we mentioned. It is very important in those agreements, speaking of the formats, to establish something special for dual degrees, because one of the aspects that we found that was complicated was that we shouldn't treat the dual degree as a normal thing in the university. One thing is the student, the ordinary student that is at the university, and another thing is the student that comes from the dual degree. So we have to contemplate payments, funding, the stay. So in that sense, there are universities that have specific rules that cover different aspects, and some forms that have to be completed through the web to apply for the dual degree. Of course, they are agreed. This is agreed. And this facilitates the process for those that are interested. From the academic perspective, we see we simplify the process. And some of the forms were more simpler, others are more complicated, but we have to consider all these aspects so that the person that is coming to a university from another institution, that comes from another country, from another culture, perhaps they find some things that are difficult to understand in the forms. So we have to take that into account.
Rather than a form, we need to have a document signed between the parties that contains very clearly everything that we are going to ensure our graduates, that university, all the requirements for admission and for graduation from both institutions. It's a document that needs to be completely detailed and clear. I think that's going to be the most important document so that the student is always aware of what they need to submit in order to graduate. The document must contain everything. Yes, and for instance, in Colombia, in our forms, we specify that the title is validated in Colombia, but we clarify that this validation doesn't mean that the person is able to work in Colombia. In order to work, they need to do another special paperwork with the School of Engineers of Colombia. That also needs to be present in the document, that caveat, so that the student is aware of that. And I think that that is the case for every single country, right? Obviously, people need to have a license in order to work in a country, and that needs to be done separately. Yes, and aside from the legal process in each country that needs to be included in that document, it's very important to clarify everything that has to do with mobility, how the student's going to be able to move around, to take courses, or whether they can do it online, remotely. That needs to be part of the document, as our colleague was saying. The process needs to be completely clear. And as for the academic aspect, the document must outline the different courses that the student will be taking when they visit the foreign country, so that the student can be aware of how they will participate in the other university and how they will be involved. And the same thing goes for resources. The document needs to clarify how the students are going to be able to pay for their education in the other institution. That needs to be part of the agreement. Well, rather than talking about a form as a document, I want to refer to a form in the sense of a way of doing things. And I want to share a success story that we have with a university in the United States. This was born out of a need that the government of the state of Chihuahua saw, because we saw a need to integrate our industry with the aerospace industry. We decided to look for a collaboration, and we reached the New Mexico University in the United States, which opened up its doors for us and really enabled us to train our students. And we created a dual degree along with that university. We have very successful graduates who are working professionally out there in the world, and we are really, really proud of that. And I want to share some of the ways in which we work with them, with this other university, and I would love to be able to implement something like this with our sister institutions from Latin America and the Caribbean. The curricula from each degree need to be equivalent. We work with a 50% match, between curricula in each institution. And working with those curricula, we saw a possibility. And right now, Our students from the University of Chihuahua do 7 semesters in our university and then go to New Mexico for the last 3 semesters. That way they complete 10 semesters and they get their dual degree from both institutions. And that is for the aerospace degree. We also have a dual degree with the New Mexico University for civil engineering. The curricula were very similar, so that made things easier for us. Almost 90% of the curricula matched. So our students do 7 semesters in our institution, then they move to New Mexico, and then do the remaining 3 semesters in New Mexico. Also, the University of New Mexico offered us the possibility to grant a master's degree to our students if they did another year at the New Mexico University. That was something that was amazing for our students and that really, really opened up new doors for them to be able to leverage and make the best of these formats at an international level. I want to let you know that I'm willing to collaborate with you. If any of you is interested in creating a process like that, I can help you with the negotiations or the activities with both institutions. And I heard you mention resources, and that's a key issue. We know that US universities are pretty expensive, and they were also really open to support us in terms of costs. They have a cost of around $7,000 per semester, and they offered us the possibility to pay $2,000. That's key to our students. And we have a lot of students who have a dual nationality who take this as an opportunity to study in Mexico and then take the last 2 semesters in the United States. That's a very useful thing for our students. I remain at your disposal if any of you would like to talk to me about these types of negotiations and collaborations. I'm here for you. And in my university, the University of Chihuahua, we also work with a lot of students from Central America. We've had graduate and postgraduate students from all of Central America, and we can also receive students from there. Thank you. Anybody else wants to say anything? Okay, thank you, Javier. And to add to what you said, well, rather than a form, we need to think about the contents. The contents need to be clear because that is what the students are going to be adapting to and the institutions as well. If I say that the student needs to take a certain course, then they need to do it. Whereas if we force them to do something that's not specified in the agreement, in the document, then they won't be willing to do it, right? So that's an important thing to consider. When the French ministry sent me to do the dual degrees in Argentina, Colombia, and Brazil, I always insisted on the fact that the student could only access the second diploma once they had the first diploma from their home university. People with dual nationality, once they get to the foreign country and they get the degree, they don't want to commit to another extra year to get the first degree that they were originally pursuing. So it's a good thing to say, okay, you need to get your original degree first, and only then will you be able to get your second degree. That's a way of preventing, people leaving the country and never pursuing the original degree. There are many students with dual nationalities, and this is a way of getting them to make an extra effort and to keep them in their home countries. And I also have the case of a student from Medellin, Colombia, whose university would not grant her the degree because her English diploma was not up to the requirements of the Medellin University. We had given her a B2 English diploma accredited by a label, and the University of Medellin was telling us that she had to pursue different diplomas, so she had to go through additional levels of English training. So, that needs to be in the document as well. Okay, next question. According to everything that you've been doing, what do you consider are the general and common aspects that we need to consider for dual degree programs? Well, many of the aspects that need to be considered are aspects that we've mentioned. I would like to mention the common aspects, meaning the aspects that every single institution considers key. Obviously, each institution has their own standards, and we need to come to agreements and negotiations. But we mentioned the agreement, then we also mentioned the process of validation for each degree in other countries. In Colombia, one thing is to validate one's degree, and then the other thing is to get the license in order to be able to work. But we also need to be very clear as to how validation will take place. In Colombia, validation, especially in everything related to health, is much more strict than for other degrees. Certificates of national or international validation of the degrees. That's another thing. When universities set up a dual degree program, they always prioritize programs that are accredited by international institutions or by institutions in their own country in order to ensure quality of the program. We also mentioned the linguistic aspect. Obviously, depending on where the student is going to be pursuing their dual degree, we need to consider the linguistic aspects. And, if the student is going to pursue that degree, we need to be clear on what level of language the student needs to have. Also, responsibilities. We need to define responsibilities. Every institution has a section on their own responsibilities and a group of people who's in charge of enforcing those responsibilities. And when it comes to responsibilities, it would be really important to have academic responsibilities, but also responsibilities that go beyond the academic aspect, human responsibilities. That's something that is often overlooked. Many institutions have a wellness office that is in charge of the human aspect, but it tends to be overlooked. For instance, if a student gets sick, and they are a foreign student, so they need to have an insurance, right? We've had a case where a student didn't have their insurance and they got sick, and we had to go through an entire process in order to get them medical care, especially because we know that getting sick abroad is expensive. So we need to have that covered. Also, student selection, right? How are we going to select our students, their profile, the requirements for graduate and postgraduate degrees. Also, the supply, the available vacancies for students. A university can have capacity to receive only 2 students. So we can't send them 20 students, right? We need to be aware of that. Also, evaluation systems, we need to consider that. Financial aspects, how payments are going to be made, how much each student is going to have to pay in order to pursue their degree. Also, requirements and everything related to the processes of exchange between institutions. Obviously, each institution is different, but these are common themes amongst all of the institutions that we see, common requirements that we need to consider, common aspects that we need to consider, and that need to be clarified and described in the agreement for the dual degree programs. I completely agree with Edgar, and I wanted to add something that might be obvious, but that's really important. In each country, the second institution that will be providing the degree needs to be recognized by the Ministry of Education of the other country. Country needs to certify that that degree is going to be valid in the country that the student comes from. That's an important thing that we need to consider. Fabián, Sonia? I would also mention the name of the proposal, right? We always work with territorial demands, so degrees have to be relevant, and also tutors. Tutors have to be in contact amongst, with each other. Jaime, you wanted to say something? Well, I completely agree. We also need to consider the cultural aspect, the language that the student is going to be speaking when pursuing the dual degree. Sometimes students can be really eager to go abroad, but once they find themselves in a different country, in a different culture, speaking a different language, well, universities need to be able to provide emotional support for students in those situations. And if we don't make that clear in the agreement and the document that we're going to be signing, well, that's a mistake. We need to clarify that universities need to provide emotional support for students. We've had cases like that in our university, where we have exchange students who suffer from depression, or students that are normal when you go from one culture to another. Everything is important. Reviewing the legal aspects and also providing emotional support for the students to pursue these dual degrees. Thank you, Jaime. It's true. It's true. We need to support students before they leave for the new country. And I've seen some students who have left our country after 48 hours because they found themselves in a situation that they didn't expect. Maybe if they had been warned about how the city, their new city is going to look like, the size of the city, etc., then they would have stayed a lot longer. I've seen people from Colombia arriving in Paris, and they try to take a taxi and they're not even able to tell the taxi driver where they want to go, or they are not aware of the distances between different places. Americans are incapable of pointing out different cities on a map sometimes, so they can't even imagine sometimes the distances between cities. So that's something that we need to consider. We need to educate students about their destination before they leave for their destination. Then also costs. it would be really interesting to reach an agreement on academic costs for a school semester. And for dual degree, we also have fees that students need to pay in order to get the degree itself, right? Some seals of approval from the state that they need to pay for it. We also need to provide for that in the agreement and in the document. Students need to be aware of that. That's also very interesting to observe. And as for the PhDs, well, we need to be really clear on the fees that the students are going to pay. Sometimes students decide to pursue a dual PhD or what we call a PhD sandwich, and the resources are not shared. So in the end, they are not able to continue with the degree. So everything needs to be in writing. Everything needs to be clear in the document so that there are no surprises. Moving on, what are the main challenges and benefits or advantages that higher education institutions have experienced after implementing dual degree programs, and which strategies have been most effective to overcome those challenges? Have you had any experiences in this sense? Have you seen challenges and ways to overcome those challenges? Maybe that is something that we need to do in order to improve our degrees. Okay, go ahead. I'll start. Well, I think that there are different experiences, and I'll tell you about ours. We don't have a lot of students in dual degrees. We have very few, actually, mainly for economic reasons and economic challenges or financial limitations. That's a key challenge for us due to the social and economic levels of our students. So the challenge is how to incorporate resources that allow students to pursue dual degrees. We have something called passport grant, but that is not enough. The student needs to, still make pretty large payments in order to pursue a dual degree. That is a challenge for us that is not easy to overcome. Most of our students are not able to apply for dual degrees because they cannot afford them. We have an issue with resources, and sometimes these passport grants or passport scholarships that we provide are not enough. The analysis, we need to conduct an analysis in order to ensure that the degree is going to be useful for the student. A student can pursue a degree and then have a dual degree after that, but have no use for it, right? The student needs to make sure that the dual degree is going to be useful for them, that it'll help them improve their professional situation and even their personal situation. That's a challenge. We've had cases of students who have pursued double degrees, who have obtained the degrees, but they are not able to apply them later because they are not able to use the degree from the second country that adds no value to them. That those are the two main challenges that I've found. And, sometimes we look at the numbers and we don't have that many students.
I would say that another important challenge is that both institutions should agree both on the academic aspects and on the economic aspects, because both institutions will incur into expenses for that student. So it should be very clear how the mobility will be managed and how the universities will participate. That's the first thing, the agreement between both universities. Then facilitate the participation of the student in the program, because as Edgar mentioned, resources are needed. At the end of the day, everything has to do with resources. Even if the university has the program, making it affordable for the public as a whole is a big challenge. So on the one hand, both universities designing a good common working plan for the dual degree and the possibility for that student to have the resources. In my institution, we have experiences with dual degrees with Italy and France for engineering. And the big challenge is, on the one hand, the number of students that can apply is very small because of their financial resources. They have to face many expenses. Then the aspect of the language. It's difficult to find students that are proficient in French. Sometimes the economic part is not a big issue because they have access to scholarships, but the language is a problem. And then the talent flight. Those that left Italy have not returned. They are in companies in the automotive sector, and we're happy because they have big opportunities. I mean, they have gone to Italy and they have stayed there. That's what I mean, and we're happy for them. I think that among the biggest challenges that we face as institutions, particularly for students, is the language. As my colleague said, we also have agreements with France, with some universities in France. And in Mexico, we have more students speaking English because of our geographic closeness to them. French is more difficult, so we need programs in that case to support them since they join the institution so they can start learning the language. So they can go to France and already mastering the French language. They also have to sit for an exam. They have to pass the exam, the language exam, to stay at the university there. So it's very important to include these aspects in the agreements and in the documents, and to implement the language classes. I think that the main challenge is to attract the students, because sometimes we have the resources, but the student is afraid of leaving their comfort zone, their home with their parents. So we need to be strategic with the social media. Our universities have very good social media. So we should post the best practices, showing the students that have gone to another country, showing that they're doing fine, they have new friends. The most difficult part for me is really to attract the students, to show them in Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, so the students can see it and say, "Oh, my friend is now there. He's doing great. He looks better. He looks happier." So everything, comes through the eyes by seeing their attitudes and their behavior. I think that's a good strategy. Thank you. Yeah, there are lots of anecdotes. Sometimes It has happened that couples have been formed. And in the past, a Spanish boy and a Brazilian girl asked me to marry them in Brazil. And I went there and I married them because they said, well, thanks to you, we got to meet one another. And I have many experiences of dual degree. I'm working at Airbus, one said, because the degree from your university allowed me to join the company. And as I have the Spanish citizenship, I will be able to work there in this company that cooperates with the Chihuahua University in aviation. And that's because I told them, go to Mexico to do a dual degree. And, well, we have to recover those experiences. I think that the next challenge, perhaps for next year, would be to invite students that have been through the double degree process so that, as Jaime is saying over the Zoom, they can share their impressions. With a PhD, it's a little more complex. There are good and bad experiences. We have this case of the brain flight, those that went to France. I wanted to stay there in the industry, but they've had to hide their PhD because the industry in France, there is a legislation, and if you have an X number of years of education, you have to pay based on that. So in the industry, paying a salary to an engineer based on their PhD degree, and perhaps that engineer is going to do the same job as a regular engineer, they're going to hire the engineer that does not have the PhD. So it's important to have R&D in the company. I know several engineers that have a PhD, a dual degree from Colombia that are working in France in the industry. But to obtain their jobs, they had to conceal the fact that they had a PhD. That's unfortunate, but I know many also that are in academia and their PhD has helped them stay in academia. So I think that these experiences are interesting to improve the conditions, the forms, to avoid losing these PhDs. You give them a millionaire aid and say, okay, you have to return it, or you have to stay at the institution for an X number of years as a payback. So it's some say this is like bribing. No, it's not bribing. We have facilitated things for you, but you have to give something in return. I was taking some notes of many of the things we discussed in terms of the challenges. And let me mention four that I think have been mentioned by the other speakers. The first one, or the most evident one, is the curricular alignment, thinking what courses will be equivalent. That's essential. Second, regulation and accreditation of each country. That's another challenge within the dual degree process. Because in Colombia, they ask for certain tests. In Peru, they ask for something else. So that complicates many times the dual degree processes. And we are experiencing this in our process right now. The third aspect is logistics and the costs associated to mobility. Who's going to bear those costs if the student can afford them? If not, unfortunately, in our universities, although there are students with resources, they are the minority. So how are we going to make it possible for other students to have access? And the fourth challenge is the cultural and language adjustment, as I mentioned. I think it's also part of the success of this process. And in order to have the visibility that Dean Claudia mentioned before, to have this visibility of the success stories, we have to include these four aspects, but the last one is always neglected. So I think those are the four challenges for us. Something that works for us, and I mentioned this yesterday at the discussion on the chair, is that we have used the presence of our graduates in other countries to promote this idea that students should follow or should go through this immersion process, particularly in PhD courses. So we've had an office in Poland, Barcelona, with somebody there that is visible, that is responsible. It's a graduate student that helps with these processes that have to do with research. It's not a PhD dual degree, but the research part. So through the research, they start the research process. It can be easier then to apply to a dual degree. We have the PhD in engineering so we are promoting the dual degree with a PhD in Poland, and we are starting with Barcelona. But the idea is using the graduates that are there already in their PhD process so that they can promote others to follow. Of course, not only having there, but as we say, we have offices in Poland, and Barcelona. So that's easier to deal with the dual degree processes. A good practice is interpersonal relationships and the international affair offices. If there are no offices like that, then the office of the deputy president or international relationships are very important to promote these exchanges, and that strengthen these dual degree processes. In my case, as deans and with these departments, this facilitates things, particularly now. It's easier to work in another country. So promoting this idea that after the dual degrees, the students can obtain jobs in other countries, but remotely, or they can have two jobs. They can work in our country and they can also work in another country remotely. So the idea is to promote that this dual degree, the second degree they're going to obtain, will open the doors to another country without having to leave their own. That's a good initiative. And that's something we can also support from our positions and encourage universities to approach other international institutions and create this scenario for students to see it attractive and be willing to have access to the dual degree. Absolutely, I agree with what my colleague said. And I'd like to add that the institution itself should make a contribution in the area of the flexibilization of the processes so that students don't feel that the dual degree means I have to meet all the requirements here and all the requirements there. That generates a lot of stress. So making it a simpler, more streamlined process for students to see the experiences of other students that did it before and they dare participate in the dual degree processes. I think it's very important to identify the strengths of each institution in order to make the best use of them and attract the PhD students to obtain a dual degree in another institution, to remove the fear, as you mentioned before, the fear of leaving the country and going to another culture. So I think that when we identify the strengths of each institution, we will motivate our students and we will approach those institutions in order to work together for the benefit of our students. I think we can do something at LACCEI. LACCEI facilitates that actually, to identify our strengths and combining them and making the best use of them. Would you like to add anything, Jaime? No, I'm fine. I think that everything has been said. Okay. The next challenge for LACCEI 2025 will be the triple degrees. This year, we've focused on dual degrees. let us add another difficulty to it, and let's move on to the triple degrees. Luis Manuel, who has launched the presentation, he has had triple degrees. He will let us know about his experience. I think that as long as there is funding, there is triple degree, and that's it. So we'll see you in Mexico City. Well, if you want to assist in this, of course, the participants, this is not a closed group. You can join us. We admit new experiences or challenges and say, okay, let's see, between or among three of our institutions, how would we organize a triple PhD or a triple master course and see if it's feasible and what are the challenges we would face. So let's share experiences from now until a year from now in Mexico City. Thank you so much for attending our session. If there's any question, of course, we will be open. Claudia, Edgar, Aldo, Remy, Sonia, Fabian, or Jaime from abroad. I think we have around 20 minutes before the closing ceremony starts. I'll be passing the mic. Thank you, Luis Fernando. Well, first of all, congratulations to the group. You've worked very hard. You have produced or you have started a project that I'm sure will be one of the most attractive projects at LACCEI. As part of the Committee of Intercultural and International Affairs, I have three aspects to mention that is food for thought in these dual degree processes. In Colombia, we had the opportunity of working with the CCJK project, institutions that led a process with the ministry to work in dual degree processes. First, something we experienced here, and the conference for some started on Wednesday, but for others started on Monday, and that's the international accreditation processes. Right now, that is the priority. It's an added value for any accreditation process because somehow it facilitates the program meeting international standards, and that helps the program be in line. I was mentioning, well, the first speaker mentioned that at the beginning, and it's the issue of the articulation that is necessary between the host institution, the one that receives the student, and the institution that sends the student, the master and slave, as we say it in engineering. That is essential. This is not any accreditation organization in particular, but it's important for us to consider that that facilitates things. I'm not speaking of a national accreditation agency, ABET, Argosur, or ARACE, CASE. Any accreditation organization is important right now. And above all, being clear about the geographic area, the area of action, the scenario that is suitable for the accreditation. Now, let's speak of what happens before. I have created my program, so there I have to start thinking of what universities I will partner with or where I will create my network of contacts for my dual degree process. We are not going to start there. We're going to start far before that. And that is when I think of creating a program. And that's why the study of the state of the art is so important, and the justification of the program, how I justify it locally, nationally, and internationally. when I'm making that justification and the study of pertinence, it's very important to consider the curricula that already exists internationally that will serve as a model for me to create mine based on the needs or based on what the environment is demanding and the profile of graduates I would like to have, but always thinking of having some models, some international models, because that will facilitate a standardization process moving forward. And the third is the fact that today here we're not speaking, and I think my colleague mentioned this from the Cooperative of Colombia. Oh, I don't remember who, but we were speaking of the forms. It's not a question of forms like filling out a form. We're speaking of universities that agree on creating a register in the country of origin. I'm from Colombia. I talked to a colleague in Mexico, but in Colombia, the program will have a qualified register, and that prevents or that facilitates the future process. But other forms, as they mentioned here, sometimes the student can be part of the career abroad. And Panama, for instance, and based on the regulations in the country, their constitution demands that the student that has graduated from that program should study things about the Panama Canal and the international agreements with the state. That's another model. So once the program is created, I can work with a member university to standardize the profiles. And what is standardized, apart from the subject matter, is the degree. So there's a wide range of possibilities. I wanted to add this to the wonderful presentations.
Thank you. I saw that somebody else was raising their hand. Yes, thank you. I'm Gustavo Rivera. I'm from Colombia. And I want to say I really admire what you're doing. I think that your work really supports LACCEI's goals, and your work is really important. My intervention has to do with the following. We are talking about collaborating, amongst educational institutions and companies. However, usually these dual degrees usually require full-time students. And my concern has to do with the possibility of expanding the agreements with companies so that students moving to another country are still able to carry out their work, are able to keep their job without losing their job. Maybe they can use telework, work remotely from their country of destination, and so as to not lose their jobs. That's what I wanted to say. Well, in that sense, our PhD program is academic and it meets all of the requirements of the Ministry of Education of Colombia, but it is also an industrial program. What we are doing is we're doing research for that country, and PhD students need to work on particular problems. And that facilitates the dual degree process. And in that sense, the link with the industry, with what is really needed from the industry, The proposal is not made by the student for our PhD programs. The proposal is made by the industry. The industry points out a problem that they have, and then the student is selected based on that. That allows for the student to have an opportunity to actually interact with the industry, solving a particular problem of the industry. That way, we link our students in the dual degree programs, and in the case of our PhD programs, to the actual industry, to get them to solve an actual problem in the industry. We do it with Poland. I wanted to add something. We have some business practices. The students need to do mentorships and practices before graduating. And in the dual degree programs, we also need to ensure that the students have access to these mentorships so that they're able to work in these companies. There is a risk that the student might not continue, but they can also continue. That is also something that we need to consider. We need to ensure that the dual degree agreement allows for the students to do their mentorships, their business mentorships. In France, it's an obligation, it's mandatory. Every single institution granting engineering degrees has to have a final project where the industry has to work in the industry. The student, sorry, has to work in the industry. The student needs to find the business or the company themselves in order to have them certify their professional experience. And the state forces the industry to pay the student. In our dual degree programs, we always tell the students that, of course, you're going to have to cover their costs, but they will be receiving a salary during 6 months of their training. They receive 25% of the French minimum wage, which is around 500 or 600 euros, but the company can decide to pay more. If the student is having great results, maybe the company can decide to raise their pay, their salary, and then hire them after they graduate. Any other questions? Well, thank you.